Long before London was London, the river was already there. The Thames, wide and slow, winding through fields and forests. A silent mirror reflecting the endless English sky. For centuries it carried no ships, no bridges, no human sound beyond the splash of oars carved from fallen trees. Then, around the middle of the 1st century, strangers came from across the sea. They spoke Latin. They marched in straight lines. They were the Romans, and they brought with them iron, stone, and discipline that would change the island forever. They called the place Londinium, a settlement built on the river's north bank, where the tides would be controlled, and the land was firm enough to build walls. The Romans liked order, and so they gave the wilderness a plan. Streets were drawn with precision, crossing at right angles, forming a grid where there had been nothing but mud and reeds. Timber buildings rose quickly, warehouses, markets, and homes for merchants. The city became a port, a vital link between Britannia and the heart of the empire. Londinium grew fast, coins clinked, hammers rang, and smoke curled upward from forges and kitchens. In less than 20 years, it was bustling with traders from across the Roman world, Spaniards selling olive oil, Gauls bringing wine, Egyptians with linen and papyrus. The Thames became a road of water, filled with ships from every corner of the empire. But Rome's peace never lasted long. In the year 60 AD, rebellion broke out. Boudica, the queen of the Iceni, rose against Roman rule. Her armies swept across southern Britain, burning everything in their path, and Londinium was one of the first to fall. The governor, Suetonius Paulinus, could not defend it. He ordered an evacuation, leaving the city to its fate. What followed was fire. Flames roared through the streets, timber walls collapsing into the river. When the smoke cleared, Londinium was gone, and yet it was rebuilt. Because the Romans always rebuilt. Stone replaced wood. New walls were raised around the city, thick, strong, and enduring. They still stand today, hidden between modern buildings, fragments of an ancient skeleton. For the next 3 centuries, Londinium became one of the most important cities in Roman Britain. It had baths, temples, and a great basilica, the largest building north of the Alps. Its merchants grew rich, its streets were paved, and its citizens drank from aqueducts that brought clean water from miles away. But the empire that built it was already beginning to crumble. By the 4th century, the legions were withdrawing. Rome was stretched too thin, its borders collapsing, its cities starving. When the Romans left Britain around 410 AD, Londinium was abandoned once again. Its walls still stood, but its streets fell silent. Grass grew where soldiers once marched. The Thames flowed on, patient and unchanging. Centuries passed. Storms came and went. Forests crept closer again. For a time, London was a ghost, a city without people. Only the stones remained, whispering the memory of empire. Then, slowly, life returned. Anglo-Saxon settlers built small villages nearby, simple wooden huts on the higher ground west of the old Roman ruins. They called it Londonwick, a trading town by the water. They were not empire builders, but farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen. They spoke a new tongue, and their gods were different. But the river was the same. the same quiet silver thread that had once carried Roman galleys. In time, Londonwick grew. Markets reopened. Boats from across the North Sea came to trade furs, amber, and slaves. The Saxons built churches and workshops. But in the 9th century, new invaders came, fierce men from across the sea, carrying axes and wearing iron helmets, the Vikings. They burned and plundered. They sailed up the Thames, striking without warning, taking gold and captives before vanishing back into the fog. London, or what was left of it, suffered again. Yet, even in ruin, the city survived. King Alfred the Great, ruler of Wessex, saw the ruins of the old Roman walls and realized their value. He ordered the city to be reoccupied and fortified. The Saxon Londonwick was abandoned, and the people moved back inside the Roman walls. The city was reborn once more, this time as Londonburg. The Romans had built strong foundations, and Alfred built upon them. New houses, new walls, new hope. It was the beginning of medieval London, a city that would soon become the beating heart of England. By the time the 11th century dawned, London had become more than a settlement. It was the heart of a kingdom in formation. The old Roman walls still marked its edges, a reminder of endurance. Inside, timber houses crowded narrow lanes, and the sound of church bells mingled with the cries of traders selling wool, fish, and bread. England was a patchwork of shifting rulers. Saxons, Danes, and, once again, Saxons. Kings came and went, often leaving behind more smoke than legacy. But one king, Edward the Confessor, built something that would outlast them all. A great church on the banks of the Thames, just west of the city. It was called Westminster Abbey. Edward's church became his monument, and around it a royal seat began to grow. London was transforming, not just a city of trade, but of power. The merchants of Cheapside grew wealthy, and the guilds began to organize. Ships from Flanders and France docked along the river, bringing spices and cloth, leaving with English wool. But everything would change in 1066. That year, a Norman duke crossed the sea with an army of knights and archers. His name was William. He claimed the English throne and took it by force at Hastings. When he reached London, the city prepared to resist, but William's army surrounded it. After a brief stand, the citizens surrendered. And so, William the Conqueror entered the city that would become the jewel of his new realm. To mark his triumph and to secure his rule, he ordered a fortress built beside the river. Stone by stone it rose, white limestone brought from France, led by Saxon hands. It became known as the Tower of London. The tower was not just a castle, it was a message, a reminder that England now belonged to Normandy, and that London, above all, was under the eye of the king. Around it, the city pulsed with life. Craftsmen filled the streets, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, and barges crowded the river. St. Paul's Cathedral dominated the skyline, a Romanesque masterpiece built to replace an older wooden church destroyed by fire. Its spire pierced the London fog, visible for miles. The Norman kings ruled harshly, but their reign brought order. Under William's successors, London grew rich and more confident. By the 12th century, it had become one of the largest cities in Europe, a maze of wooden houses, markets, and churches within the old Roman walls. Beyond them, fields and villages stretched toward the horizon. In 1176, a new marvel began to rise, London Bridge. Not the old wooden crossings that washed away each generation, but a bridge of stone. It took 33 years to build, spanning the Thames with 19 arches and lined with houses and shops. It became a city within the city, narrow, crowded, alive with the sound of footsteps and trade. London Bridge became a symbol of the city's ambition and of its defiance. When the Thames froze in winter, people skated and danced across it. When it flooded, they clung to the bridge's arches for safety. Through every disaster, it stood firm, just like the city itself. The medieval centuries were both magnificent and miserable. London was a place of wealth and poverty, beauty and stench. Its streets were so narrow that people could shake hands across them. Filth ran through open gutters. Animals roamed freely. Yet among the dirt stood churches, guild halls, and mansions of carved stone. Markets overflowed with goods from distant lands: French wine, Flemish cloth, Italian glass. The bells of Saint Mary le Bow rang over the city, marking the hours of prayer and trade. Londoners were proud and loud, quick to argue and quick to rebuild when disaster struck, and disaster came often. In 1216, during the civil war between King John and his barons, the city was seized by rebels. Fires broke out. But once again London endured. A few years later, King John's son, Henry III, rebuilt and expanded the tower, turning it into a royal palace. He also began rebuilding Westminster Abbey in the new Gothic style, light, soaring, filled with stained glass. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of grandeur and gloom. The population swelled. Over 100,000 people crowded within the walls. Ships from every known land arrived daily. Money flowed through the markets like water through the river, yet famine and disease were never far away. Then in 1348, a ship from the continent carried something invisible. It was not a weapon, nor an army, but it would kill half the city: the Black Death. The year was 1348. A merchant ship docked along the Thames, its crew sick and silent. Rats scurried down the ropes. The plague had come to London. Within weeks, the city became a place of fear. Corpses were carted through the streets at dawn, piled outside the walls. Priests carried bells and incense, their prayers swallowed by the sound of mourning. The rich fled to the countryside, but death followed them there. For the poor, there was nowhere to run. They called it the Black Death, and in less than 2 years, it killed nearly half of London's people. The markets fell silent. The bells rang endlessly. The air itself seemed cursed. When the plague finally passed, fields lay empty and weeds grew where houses had stood. But London did what it always did. It endured. New families arrived. Children grew up among ruins and rebuilt them. Trade returned, slower at first, then stronger than before. The emptiness of death was filled once more with the noise of life. In the century that followed, the city changed again. Guilds gained power. Merchants grew richer than knights. Ships sailed to the Baltic, to Spain, to Italy. London became not only England's heart but also its purse. Yet peace was fragile. Kings taxed their people, nobles plotted, and the streets whispered of rebellion. In 1381, the anger of the common people boiled over. The peasants' revolt began. Tens of thousands marched from Kent and Essex toward London. demanding justice and freedom from endless taxes. When they reached the gates, the city opened to them. Crowds flooded the streets, shouting for reform. They burned records, freed prisoners, and stormed the Tower of London itself. For 2 days, London was theirs. Then the boy King Richard II met them at Smithfield. He promised peace, and as they lowered their weapons, his soldiers struck. The revolt was crushed, but something had changed. The people had discovered their voice. The following decades brought both pride and peril. The city grew even more crowded. Foreign merchants filled the docks, and the first stone mansions appeared along the river. The Guildhall was rebuilt, a hall of oak and stone for London's leaders, shining with glass windows. Pageants filled the streets on feast days, with banners, songs, and laughter. But beneath the color and ceremony, danger never slept. In the 1400s, England was torn apart by the Wars of the Roses, rival houses fighting for the throne. Armies clashed across the land, yet London stood firm. Whoever ruled England needed London, its gold, its people, its power. And so the city learned to survive politics the way it had survived plague, by keeping its head down and its gates strong. The wars ended in 1485 when Henry Tudor defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field. The crown changed hands again, and London celebrated with bonfires that lit up the night sky. The Tudor age had begun, and with it came a new chapter in the city's story, one of kings, queens, and transformation. When the Tudors came to power, London was already bursting at its seams. Its narrow medieval lanes could no longer contain its ambition. Merchants, sailors, scholars, and thieves all crowded the same streets, breathing the same smoky air. The city was alive in every sense of the word, restless, expanding, impatient. In 1509, Henry VIII became king. He was young, strong, and eager to prove himself. London adored him at first, the handsome prince, the promise of glory. Pageants filled the Thames, banners hung from every tower. But as years passed, that glory turned to tension. Henry broke from the Pope, declared himself head of the Church of England, and dissolved the monasteries that had stood for centuries. Monks were driven out, their abbeys seized, their libraries scattered to the winds. In London, the great monasteries of Blackfriars and Greyfriars fell silent. Their stones were sold, their halls left empty. The skyline began to change. Church spires gave way to palaces, gardens, and merchant houses. The capital was transforming from a medieval fortress into a capital of commerce. The Thames carried not only fish and grain now, but dreams of empire. At the river's edge, shipyards built vessels for exploration. Names like Drake, Hawkins, and Raleigh became legends. Londoners began to imagine a world beyond the fog. Vast oceans, golden lands, endless trade. Yet beneath this golden surface, the city still suffered. The poor lived packed together in wooden tenements, where smoke blackened every wall. Fires broke out almost daily. Plague returned again and again, carried by rats that thrived in filth and warmth. When death came, it came quickly. No warning, no cure, just silence. Still, the city refused to stop. Under Elizabeth I, London became a beacon of art, learning, and ambition. The Queen herself loved pageantry and progress. She watched plays written for her by poets who shaped the English tongue, men like Marlowe and Shakespeare. Across the river in Southwark stood the Globe Theatre. Its wooden walls echoed with laughter, applause, and words that would live forever. On summer nights, crowds gathered, rich and poor alike, to watch comedies, tragedies, and kings come alive under candlelight. It was the voice of London itself, witty, bold, defiant. But the same river that carried music and poetry also carried sickness. The plague struck again in 1563, killing tens of thousands. The theatres closed. The markets fell quiet. Every door marked with a red cross was a home of mourning. When the plague faded, fire replaced it. In 1613, the Globe Theatre itself burned down during a performance of Henry VIII, when a cannon fired on stage set the thatched roof aflame. It was rebuilt, of course it was rebuilt, because that's what London always did. The 17th century arrived with both promise and fear. London was now the largest city in Europe, a labyrinth of half-timbered houses, crowded inns and narrow alleys. The Thames was thick with boats, the air thick with smoke. Rich merchants built homes of brick and glass, but most of the city was still wood, dry, brittle, waiting. As the English Civil War broke out in 1642, London became the stronghold of Parliament against King Charles I. The city armed itself. Its citizens manned walls and watchtowers. When the king was captured and executed in 1649, it was London that had given his enemies the strength to defy him. For a time, England had no king. But cities do not wait for crowns. Commerce continued, trade expanded, and London grew ever denser. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 under Charles II, the city celebrated widely. Bonfires blazed, bells rang, and fireworks lit up the sky. No one could know that in just 6 years fire would return, not in celebration but in destruction. The year was 1665. London had survived kings and wars, rebellion and plague. It had grown richer, louder, and more crowded than ever. But under its surface, the old fears waited. It began quietly. A few deaths in the poorer parishes. A rumor of sickness spreading from house to house. Then the word appeared again. A word that froze the blood of every Londoner. Plague. The city had seen it before, but this time was different. In summer, the heat thickened, and death spread like smoke. The bells rang without rest. The red crosses returned, painted on doors with trembling hands. Lord, have mercy upon us. By July, thousands were dying each week. The streets emptied. Wagons rolled at night, carrying the dead to mass graves outside the walls. Watchmen stood guard at infected houses, locking whole families inside. No one dared to knock. The rich fled north to the countryside while the poor stayed and prayed. Doctors walked in long cloaks with beaked masks stuffed with herbs, their eyes hidden behind glass. The smell of smoke and death filled the air. Cats and dogs were killed in the belief they carried the disease. The Thames, once alive with ships, became eerily quiet. By autumn, the plague reached its height. Half the city's people were gone, some dead, others vanished. Grass grew between cobblestones. Churchyards overflowed. Only the wind moved freely through the empty markets. Then, as winter came, the cold slowed the sickness. The carts stopped. Doors opened again. London had survived, just barely. The living stumbled out of their homes like ghosts, blinking into the pale sunlight of 1666. They began to rebuild, to clean, to trade once more. The bells rang again, not for the dead but for life. But fate was not finished with London yet. It was early September when it began, in a bakery on Pudding Lane. A small spark, a careless flame, perhaps a gust of wind through an open window. No one paid much attention at first. Fires were common in a city made of wood. But the summer had been dry, and the wind was strong. The flames caught the neighboring house, then another, then 10 more. By morning the fire had become a storm. The heat roared through the narrow streets, consuming everything in its path. Wooden beams cracked and fell like thunder. Windows burst. The air shimmered with smoke and ash. People ran with what they could carry: a Bible, a child, a handful of coins. Carts overturned, horses bolted, and the sound of bells was drowned by the roar of fire. The sky glowed red, visible for miles. The Thames reflected the flames like molten gold. St. Paul's Cathedral, proud and ancient, stood at the city's heart. Its great roof of lead began to melt and run down the walls in silver streams. The stones cracked from the heat. Within hours, the cathedral collapsed, its vast dome crashing into the fire below. The city's soul went with it. For 4 days London burned. Whole parishes vanished, over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and the homes of nearly 100,000 people. Flames leaped from street to street faster than men could flee. Even the river seemed to burn as tar and oil caught fire along the wharves. The king himself rode through the smoke, helping to organize fire breaks, ordering houses torn down to stop the spread. Buckets of water were thrown in vain. The wind carried embers farther east, turning the night sky into a rolling sea of fire. When the wind finally died, the flames began to fade. What remained was silence. The once great city was a desert of ash and stone. The air was thick and grey. Smoke drifted from the ruins like breath from a dying body. People wandered among the wreckage in disbelief, some weeping, some silent, all covered in soot. Where streets had been, there were only blackened lines in the dust. The tower had survived, but everything beyond was gone. Even the rats were dead. Yet in the distance, through the haze and ruin, the river still flowed, calm, steady, indifferent. It had seen Londinium rise and fall. It had watched plague, war, and now fire. And it would watch again when London returned, because London always returned. The night the fire finally died, London stood in eerie silence. For 4 straight days the city had burned like a funeral pyre, its heat so fierce that glass had melted in church windows, and lead had flowed from rooftops into the gutters. Now smoke drifted across a landscape of blackened chimneys and skeletal walls. A cold rain began to fall, hissing against the embers. From the hill at Moorfields one could see the entire old city lying in ruin. The spire of old St. Paul's a hollow shell, the Thames still reflecting faint orange light from smouldering wharves. 87 parish churches were gone, 13,000 houses, the markets, the guild halls, the wooden bridges and courts, all reduced to ash. Yet, in that wasteland, Londoners did what they had always done. They began again. By the very next morning, carts clattered through the mud carrying salvaged timbers. Merchants were already bargaining for plots to rebuild their shops, and parish bells, the few that remained, tolled defiantly. Hope, thin as smoke, refused to vanish. King Charles II, restored to the throne barely 6 years earlier after the long Puritan Commonwealth, saw an opportunity hidden within the devastation. He declared that London would rise fairer, safer, and more magnificent than before. Architects and dreamers flooded the royal court with proposals. Grid plans, circular plazas, broad avenues like those of ancient Rome. Among them stood the scholar-architect Sir Christopher Wren, a mathematician with the soul of a poet. Wren's designs envisioned a classical metropolis of domes and colonnades, an ordered geometry to replace the medieval chaos. His plan might have changed London forever, but the city's stubborn nature resisted. Landlords clung to the crooked shapes of their inherited plots. Traders wanted speed, not grandeur. And so compromise prevailed. The new streets followed many of the old lines, though widened and paved with sturdier stone. Still, Wren's genius endured in his churches, graceful, balanced, touched by light. Above them all, one structure would dominate every horizon, the new St. Paul's Cathedral. Its dome rose slowly through 3 decades of toil, each block laid with reverence, until by 1710 it stood completed. A gleaming monument to perseverance. Londoners looked up and saw not only beauty but defiance, proof that even fire could not erase their city's soul. Rebuilding laws transformed daily life. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 banned wooden facades, required brick or stone, and mandated wider thoroughfares to prevent future infernos. Surveyors carved out open spaces like Cheapside and King Street, and new districts, Bloomsbury, Covent Garden, St. James's, grew with measured grace. Elegant squares appeared where once had been cramped courts. By century's end, London no longer looked medieval. It had stepped into the age of reason. Commerce returned with vengeance. The wharves along the Thames thrummed with activity as ships unloaded tobacco, spices, and wool. The Royal Exchange reopened, its arcades echoing with the chatter of traders. In taverns and coffeehouses, men of every trade debated politics and science. Within those smoky rooms, the pulse of modern London began to beat. Journalists scribbling pamphlets, stockbrokers sketching the first ledgers, philosophers arguing the motion of the planets. The city that had burned to cinders was now inventing the future. The newly chartered Royal Society gathered minds like Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke, who turned curiosity into method and discovery. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, gave London something even more powerful than architecture: financial gravity. Money itself began to orbit this place. And amid the bustle, ordinary Londoners adapted. Street vendors hawked pies and ribbons beneath Wren's rising spires. Apprentices courted maids along the rebuilt river stairs. Ferrymen sang as they rowed passengers across the Thames. Life, fragile yet unstoppable, flowed back through every lane. By the last years of the 1600s, the city glittered again at night. Lanterns hung above shop doors, reflecting in puddles on newly cobbled streets. The hum of voices replaced the crackle of flames. Standing atop the dome of St. Paul's, one could see roofs stretching farther than ever before, a vast sea of brick and tile rolling toward the horizon. London had endured plague, civil war, and now fire. It had been scarred, humbled, and remade. But more than that, it had learned something from the ashes, that destruction could be a form of cleansing, a violent kind of renewal. Out of the fire rose not just a city rebuilt, but a city reborn in spirit. The merchants spoke of opportunity, the philosophers spoke of progress, and the people, those who had lost everything, spoke quietly of pride. For they had seen London fall, and they had watched it rise again. They knew, as the new century approached, that their city's destiny was only beginning. By the dawn of the 18th century, London had regained its rhythm, a new confident pulse that could be heard from the docks to the coffeehouses. The scars of fire had healed, and in their place stood a city buzzing with ambition. Ships now arrived daily from across the world, sails like white wings crowding the Thames. Their hulls creaked under the weight of tea, sugar, tobacco, spices and silk. The smell of the docks was overwhelming. Tar, salt, sweat and the faint sweetness of molasses. Men shouted prices in half a dozen accents as barrels rolled over cobblestones and cranes swung high above the wharves. London was no longer just England's capital. It was the beating heart of an expanding empire. From the Caribbean to India, from the coasts of Africa to the icy waters of Canada, goods flowed toward this city as if the world itself revolved around it. The Bank of England, founded just years earlier, had stabilized the flow of credit and turned speculation into a science. The Royal Exchange, rebuilt in grand stone after the fire, became the stage where merchants and financiers built fortunes that would shape generations. But London was not simply rich, it was alive with ideas. The century that followed would come to be known as the Age of Enlightenment, and London became one of its brightest centers. In smoky coffeehouses, men and women gathered not just to trade, but to debate. The air was thick with talk of liberty, science, reason and reform. A person could walk from one side of the city to the other and hear a dozen revolutions being born in conversation. At Button's Coffee House, poets argued about beauty and truth. At Lloyd's, ship captains shared maps and tales of foreign waters. What began there would become the world's greatest insurance market. And at Garraway's, traders speculated over cups of scalding tea on the future of the entire world. Newspapers multiplied like wildfire. The Daily Current, the Spectator and the Tatler gave voice to a new public opinion, a chorus of readers hungry for knowledge. Pamphlets poured off printing presses by the thousands, their pages filled with politics, philosophy and gossip. And through it all, London kept growing. Its streets spread outward like veins from the heart. Georgian architecture, clean, symmetrical, dignified, replaced the narrow medieval timber of old. Squares like Bloomsbury, Hanover and Berkeley rose with identical facades, where red-bricked houses lined tidy gardens. The upper classes dined in candle-lit rooms, spoke of literature and music, and filled their walls with art from across the world. But beyond those polished neighborhoods lay a different London, one of cramped tenements, open sewers and poverty. In the East End, in Southwark, and along the riverbanks, thousands lived in single rooms. The city's population had exploded, drawing migrants from the countryside in search of work and fortune. For every wealthy merchant in Mayfair, there were 10 laborers living in hunger. Still, there was something magnetic about London's energy. Even the poorest could feel it, that invisible hum of possibility that ran through the air. Writers began to capture the contradictions of this great city. Daniel Defoe painted portraits of merchants and rogues alike. His Journal of the Plague Year reminded readers that progress was fragile. Jonathan Smith mocked society's hypocrisy with razor wit. And Samuel Johnson, whose dictionary gave English its shape, once wrote, "When a man is tired of London, he is tired of life." In Johnson's time, the city was already a world within itself. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along Fleet Street. Theatres at Drury Lane drew packed crowds. The bells of St. Paul's tolled over a sea of rooftops, and every night the Thames mirrored the glow of thousands of oil lamps dancing on the current. It was an age of contradictions, wealth and want, freedom and exploitation. The same ships that brought tea and sugar also carried enslaved Africans to distant plantations, fueling profits that would build London's banks and mansions. The city's greatness, like much of its empire, was shadowed by injustice. Yet, even within those contradictions, a new spirit was rising, one of reason and reform. Movements for education, abolition, and human rights began to take root. The Royal Society continued to advance discovery, while small societies and reading clubs spread literacy among common people. London was transforming from a rebuilt city into an idea, a living embodiment of human ambition, where commerce met curiosity and power met philosophy. As the century turned toward its end, the storm clouds of change gathered once again. Revolutions in America and France sent shockwaves through Europe. Old empires trembled, and kings looked nervously across the Channel. But London, resilient, stubborn, endlessly adaptive, thrived on turmoil. Trade boomed. New docks were built at Wapping and Limehouse to handle the flood of ships, and along the embankments, warehouses stretched endlessly, stacked with goods from every corner of the known world. It was said that if you stood on London Bridge at noon, you could see the entire world pass before you, from Indian sailors unloading tea, to Caribbean merchants bargaining, to English clerks scribbling ledgers in the drizzle. The hum of the city never stopped. It beat like a living heart, irregular, noisy, and unstoppable. By 1800, London was the largest city in Europe, home to nearly 1 million souls. It had become a mirror of humanity itself, brilliant, cruel, creative, and endlessly restless. And yet, as the 19th century approached, no one could imagine how much more it would change. The fires of industry were about to be lit, and once again London would transform beyond recognition. The dawn of the 19th century arrived on a tide of coal smoke. London, already vast, began to swell beyond anything the world had ever seen. Its population doubled, then tripled, until it surpassed 2 million souls, more than any other city in history. The rhythm of life quickened. Factories rose where pastures once stood, their tall chimneys exhaling black clouds that dimmed the sun. The clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, the rumble of wheels, these became the heartbeat of the new age. For the first time, London smelled not of wood and rain, but of progress itself, the thick, metallic scent of industry. The Thames, once a glittering highway of trade, grew dark with soot and sewage. At low tide, the stench was so fierce that Parliament itself had to hang soaked curtains of lime to mask it. And yet, amid that filth, a new world was being born. A world of machines, rails, and restless ambition. The Industrial Revolution had begun elsewhere, in the mills of Manchester, the forges of Birmingham, but London became its grand stage. Railways sliced through the city like veins of iron. By the 1830s, Euston Station had opened. By mid-century, Paddington and King's Cross followed. For the first time, a Londoner could board a train and reach the sea in hours instead of days. Coal and iron roared into the city, and finished products poured out again to the empire. The skyline changed. Where church steeples had once reigned, now stood gasworks, warehouses, and bridges of blackened stone. The industrial metropolis was not beautiful, but it was alive. Amid all this transformation, the human cost was immense. In the slums of Whitechapel and Southwark, thousands crowded into single rooms. Children worked long hours in match factories and breweries. Disease thrived in the narrow courts and alleys, spreading faster than any fire. Cholera swept the city again and again, carried by the same river that powdered its trade. The contrast between wealth and want grew unbearable. In Mayfair and Kensington, the rich dined under crystal chandeliers, while across the river, families slept on straw. London had become a city divided, half empire, half abyss. Writers began to capture what statistics could not. Charles Dickens gave voice to the unseen millions, the orphans, the debtors, the dreamers wandering through fog and despair. Through his stories, readers glimpsed the cruelty and kindness that coexisted in the same dark streets. His London was both monstrous and magnificent, a mirror of the age itself. And yet, progress marched on. The Great Exhibition of 1851, held inside the glittering Crystal Palace, announced to the world that Britain stood at the center of creation. The structure, vast iron ribs and glass panels stretching across Hyde Park, seemed to defy gravity. Inside, inventions gleamed beneath sunlight filtered through the roof. Steam engines, telegraphs, printing presses, looms, and locomotives. 6 million visitors came to marvel, many weeping at the sight of mankind's newfound power. This was Victorian London, proud, industrious, and convinced that its destiny was eternal. Under Queen Victoria's long reign, the city became the political and cultural capital of an empire on which the sun never set. Goods from every corner of the globe passed through its docks. Languages from Africa, Asia, and the Americas mingled in its markets. At night, gas lamps lined the boulevards, turning the fog into a golden haze. But even progress could not hide the shadows. Prostitution, poverty, and crime grew alongside prosperity. The notorious East End became a labyrinth of misery, where desperation ruled, and the police, the newly formed bobbies, struggled to keep order. The murders in Whitechapel during the 1880s shocked a nation that preferred not to see the world it had built beneath its grandeur. Still, London's innovations were unstoppable. In 1863, it became the first city on Earth to open an underground railway, the Metropolitan Line. Steam engines hissed through tunnels lit by flickering lamps, carrying workers from the suburbs into the heart of the city. It was noisy, hot, and miraculous, a new artery in the ever-growing giant. As the decades passed, monuments rose. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a fire of their own, the Tower Bridge, a marvel of iron and hydraulics, and the Victoria Embankment, reclaiming land from the river itself. Each new project seemed to declare that London had conquered both nature and time. But beneath the triumph, fatigue lingered. The poor still labored without rest, breathing the same smoke that powered the empire's wealth. The great stink of 1858, when the Thames became an open sewer, forced engineers to act. Under Joseph Bazalgette, a vast underground system of sewers and drains was built, invisible yet transformative. For the first time, London became not just large, but livable. The final decades of the century saw the rise of the Victorian middle class. Clerks, teachers, shopkeepers, people who believed in decency, progress, and the promise of education. They filled the new suburbs of Islington and Clapham, traveled to work by train, and filled their homes with books and pianos. Public parks spread across the city. Libraries and museums opened their doors to all. The British Museum, the Natural History Museum, the National Gallery, these were the cathedrals of knowledge in a secular age. By the 1890s, London was the largest and most powerful city on Earth. Its empire stretched across continents, its influence touching art, science, language, and law. But even then, in the quiet of gaslit evenings, some Londoners sensed unease. The smoke, the crowds, the endless expansion, it could not last forever. In the novels of H.G. Wells and the poems of Oscar Wilde, one hears a subtle note of exhaustion, the feeling that the city had grown too vast, too fast, that something human had been lost amid the gears of progress. And yet, to stand on Waterloo Bridge at dusk, watching the lights flicker across the Thames, was still to feel awe. Barges drifted beneath, trains thundered in the distance, and the dome of St. Paul's, blackened by soot but still proud, gleamed faintly in the dying light. London had become the modern world made flesh. It was imperfect, polluted, magnificent, and utterly alive. The 20th century began with a strange confidence. The smoke of the industrial age still hung in the air, but beneath it was a quiet hum of optimism. London stood at the height of its power, the crown of an empire that spanned the globe. Its ships ruled the seas, its banks ruled commerce, and its language carried across continents. From the steps of St. Paul's to the halls of Parliament, London seemed eternal. Yet behind the grandeur, the first cracks had begun to show. The city's population now exceeded 6 million. Electronic trams clattered alongside horse-drawn carriages. Telephones buzzed in offices, and a young generation spoke of the future with both awe and unease. In smoky drawing rooms, people whispered about the new century's promise and its dangers. Then, in the summer of 1914, that confidence shattered. When the First World War broke out, London became both fortress and heartbeat for a nation at war. Posters covered every wall, "Your country needs you," and men lined up in their thousands to enlist. Trains carried them from Waterloo and Paddington to battlefields across Europe, where many would never return. At home, the city changed overnight. Women filled the factories, munitions plants, and offices left empty by men at the front. Zeppelins floated through the night sky, dropping bombs that shattered rooftops and nerves alike. For the first time, war had come to London itself. The fear was new, an invisible enemy above the clouds, sirens wailing through fog. But even then, the city did not falter. When the war finally ended in 1918, the bells of St. Paul's rang for hours. Crowds filled Trafalgar Square, waving flags and singing through tears. The empire had survived, but at a cost too heavy to measure. The streets were filled with soldiers who would never be whole again. Men limping on crutches, faces bandaged, eyes hollow with memory. The world had changed, and London with it. The 1920s brought both relief and restlessness. Jazz drifted from dance halls in Soho. Electric lights glowed brighter each year. Cinemas spread through the city, and for the first time Londoners saw their own world projected in silver light. But beneath the glamour, poverty deepened. The working classes still toiled in cramped housing, and unemployment haunted the East End. By the 1930s, storm clouds were forming once more, not over the Thames but across Europe. News of Hitler's rise reached London's papers. Few wanted to believe another war could come. Yet when it did, in 1939, London met it with grim resolve. Nothing in its 2,000-year history would test it like the Second World War. At first came the calm, the phony war as they called it, and then in 1940 the sky itself erupted. The Blitz had begun. Night after night the Luftwaffe rained fire upon the city. Bombs fell on docks, railways, markets, homes, even the heart of Westminster. Entire streets vanished in seconds. The fires burned so bright they turned the clouds crimson. Yet amid the horror, something unbreakable emerged. Londoners refused to yield. Families slept in the underground stations, packed shoulder to shoulder on cold platforms, singing songs to drown out the thunder above. Volunteers pulled survivors from rubble, shared tea and bread with strangers, and swept the glass from shop fronts each morning as if to say, "We are still here." On one of the worst nights of the Blitz, when bombs rained upon the city centre, St. Paul's Cathedral, the same dome that had watched over London for centuries, stood untouched amid the flames. Photographers captured it rising through the smoke, defiant, its white dome glowing against the black sky. That image became the soul of wartime London, the city's unspoken vow that it would never be destroyed. When the Blitz finally ended, more than 30,000 Londoners were dead and entire neighborhoods lay in ruin. But even in grief, the city's spirit was unbroken. As one woman famously said, sweeping the rubble from her doorstep, "We can take it. We can take anything now." The war ended in 1945, and the celebrations that followed were unlike anything in memory. Crowds flooded Piccadilly Circus and Trafalgar Square, cheering, dancing, and weeping with joy. Soldiers embraced strangers, and fireworks burst over the Thames. When Winston Churchill spoke from the balcony, the roar was so loud it seemed to shake the city itself. But when the smoke cleared, London once again faced ruins, not from fire this time, but from bombs. Whole districts lay flattened, churches shattered, streets erased. The cost of victory was almost too high to grasp, and so, once again, as it had done after the Great Fire nearly 3 centuries before, London began to rebuild. This time, the work was slower, quieter, but just as determined. New housing rose amid the wreckage. The old docks, crippled by war, were slowly restored. Children played where craters had been. New schools opened in makeshift halls. The scars of war remained, but so did the laughter. The late 1940s brought rationing, austerity, and exhaustion, but also hope. The National Health Service was born, ensuring that every citizen, rich or poor, would have care. Immigrants from across the Commonwealth began to arrive, helping rebuild the city they had fought for. A new London was beginning to take shape, humbler perhaps, but more human. By 1950, the skyline still bore the wounds of war, but life had returned. The buses rolled, the bells of St. Paul's rang again, and people looked toward the future. The city had survived yet another cataclysm, not through walls or weapons, but through will. For 1,000 years, London had been through disasters, and each time it had risen again. The fire had taught it to rebuild. The plagues had taught it endurance. The wars had taught it unity. And now, standing on the edge of a new age, London was ready to become something greater than empire or power, a symbol of resilience itself. The war was over, but its echoes lingered in every street. In the 1950s, London was a patchwork of past and promise, rows of blackened buildings, walls still cracked from bombs. Beside bright new houses built by hopeful hands, children played in the ruins, their laughter rising between the hollow shells of old churches. The air smelled of dust and rain, but beneath it there was a new scent, that of life returning. The city's people were weary, but unbroken. Ration books were still in use, but so were dreams. There was a sense that London had survived the worst it would ever face, and that anything built now would last. And so, brick by brick, it began again. In the East End, families rebuilt their homes from the rubble. In Westminster, the sound of hammers echoed as workers restored the Houses of Parliament. Cranes rose above the skyline, not of destruction, but of creation. And as the decade turned, something beautiful began to happen. London opened its arms to the world. Ships arrived from the Caribbean, India, Africa, and the Pacific. Men and women stepped off trains and boats carrying little more than hope, answering Britain's call to help rebuild. They came to drive buses, to work in hospitals, to fill the factories and shops that powered the post-war recovery. Their children grew up beneath grey skies and red buses, learning to call this place home. By the 1960s, the city was reborn again, but this time not through fire or empire but through culture. The grey post-war streets suddenly burst into color. Young people filled Carnaby Street with wild clothes and louder music. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, their songs became the heartbeat of a generation. Art, film and fashion collided, and for a brief glittering moment, London was the center of the world again. The skyline began to shift once more. New towers rose beside old cathedrals. The River Thames, long neglected, began to sparkle again as new bridges and embankments took shape. The London Underground expanded, carrying millions daily beneath the earth like a vast circulatory system. And above ground, red double-decker buses and black taxis gave the city its unmistakable rhythm, a dance of motion and noise that somehow felt eternal. Through the 1970s and 80s, the city endured its share of hardship. Economic struggle, strikes, and political unrest cast long shadows. But each time, London reinvented itself, through art, through defiance, through laughter. The punk bands of the 70s sang of frustration and freedom. The street artists of the 80s turned grey walls into galleries. Even in its hardest years, London remained creative, restless, rebellious, alive. Then, in the 1990s, came another transformation. The old docklands, once silent and empty, became the shining district of Canary Wharf, a symbol of modern finance. Glass towers rose where cranes had rusted. The Millennium Dome appeared like a spaceship beside the river, and with the dawn of a new century the London Eye opened, a perfect circle turning slowly above the Thames, letting people see their city as never before. Today, London is vast, over 9 million people, countless stories and unending contrasts. It is a city of bankers and artists, scholars and dreamers, ancient stones and shining towers. From the markets of Camden to the palaces of Westminster, from the narrow alleys of Whitechapel to the green calm of Hyde Park, it remains a world within a world. The Thames still flows, as it has since before the Romans came. Barges glide where Viking ships once sailed, tourists stand on bridges where plague victims once crossed, and beneath it all, the heartbeat of London endures, steady, patient, and eternal. If you walk its streets at night when the noise fades and the air grows soft, you can almost hear the echoes of every age layered together. The bells of Wren's churches, the clatter of Georgian carriages, the whistle of Victorian trains, the sirens of the Blitz, and somewhere, faint but clear, the sound of laughter, the sound of people living, surviving, rebuilding. London has been burned, bombed, rebuilt and reborn more times than perhaps any city on earth. It has learned to carry its past not as a burden, but as music, a melody of memory that plays quietly beneath the surface of every new beginning. And as the lights shimmer on the river, you realize this is what makes London eternal. Not its monuments or power, but its spirit, the simple, stubborn will to keep going, to keep dreaming, to keep living. So tonight let the river carry you gently through time. Let the hum of the city fade to a whisper. The story of London, fierce, fragile, unending, is still being written. And somewhere beyond the horizon, as dawn begins to glow over the Thames, another day in its 1,000-year tale quietly begins.